is the new 2023 Honda Civic Type R, and it's a totally new, fully redesigned Civic Type R. It replaces the outgoing Civic Type R, which looks like it was designed over the phone. And today I'm going to review the new Civic Type R and show you all of its quirks and features. All right, time for the quirks and features of the new Civic Type R. I'm going to start under the hood, where you have a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engine. Now, this is the same powertrain that was used in the old Civic Type R, but there are some improvements. Specifically, the turbocharger has been improved with some optimizations to allow for better performance, and the exhaust has also been improved. And the result is, well, two things actually. For one, more power and torque. This car has 315 horsepower, which is 9 more than the outgoing Civic Type R, and 310 pound-feet of torque, which is 15 pound-feet more than the old Type R. But in addition to that, this is also the most powerful Honda ever sold in the United States. The most powerful Honda ever is the new Civic Type R. Now, when you look under the hood, as you've seen, it looks kind of cool under here. You have this engine cover with red and black, and it says Honda, and it sort of reminds you of a Honda lawnmower, to be totally honest, but it also looks cool and sporty. And then further down from that, you have Type R printed, so even when you get under the hood, you know what car this is. The really cool thing, though, is there's no giant plastic engine cover that covers up everything and makes stuff difficult to access. Everything is relatively accessible and easy under here, so you can just get at it and start tuning. But anyway, with the basics of the powertrain covered, before I get into the quirks and features of the new Civic Type R, let's talk through the basics of the car itself. New Civic Type R is obviously based on the new Honda Civic, which came out, I think, a little over a year ago, and it's only based on the Civic hatchback. This is hatchback only, no sedan, no coupe, just the hatchback, which is kind of a hallmark of the Civic Type R. It's always been a high-performance hatchback. Now, sticker price on this will be right around $44,000 with shipping, but good luck trying to buy one for that price. We all know dealers are going to mark these things up like crazy, $15,000, $20,000+ markups, but Honda's MSRP is around $44,000 with shipping. Now, as for transmission, these will only be offered with a 6-speed manual, and they are still front-wheel drive. A lot of hot hatchbacks have shifted to all-wheel drive, but not the Civic Type R. It's front-wheel drive only. And maybe most importantly about the new Civic Type R, it's actually attractive. The outgoing Civic Type R model was so laughably overstyled to the point of being cringeworthy that it was honestly a little bit hard to look at. And every time I see one in traffic, I don't respect the Type R. I kind of laugh a little bit inside. They are not attractive cars. This does not make me particularly beloved in the Civic Type R community, but it's the truth. The new Civic Type R is very different. Everything is more restrained, more rational, more reasonable. It simply is not only better looking than the old one, but actually a generally nice looking car. Now, there's a lot of important details to mention on the outside of this new Civic Type R, but probably my favorite is the wide body. You can see it very clearly from your angle, and if you look closely, the front fender has been widened to give it a more muscular look, and basically the entire rear of the car has been widened as well. The fender back there, but also the rear door, which looks like what you'd find on a standard Civic, but it's completely unique to the Civic Type R because it's wider. It has that muscular stance, and it really does look more athletic with its cool wide body. Now, beyond that, there's a lot of other differences and changes that make this Civic Type R a lot more attractive than the outgoing model. The biggest of which, to me, is that the old one was kind of a mess of scoops and intakes and vents that looked stupid, and some of them were completely non-functional, and this car ditches almost all of those in favor of a more cleaner, sort of attractive, basic look, instead of having these radically overstyled vents inserted everywhere. With that said, this car does still have a few little vents, although they seem to be functional. You got one behind the front wheels, you can see here on the wider front fender. I assume that's for aerodynamics. And you have another very obvious one on the hood right here, you can see, and that presumably is for heat extraction. For the engine, when it gets hot, it can cool down with those vents on the hood itself. Now, on the outside of the new Civic Type R, probably probably the most pronounced upgrade compared to the regular Civic, at least up front, is this giant lower front grille. You can see this giant honeycomb pattern grille. It's huge. It opens so air can come into the intercooler, and it's massive. You have this honeycomb pattern that also matches the one on the grille right above it, but a big, more aggressive front grille design for the more powerful Type R. Now, also up here, you can see two other important items. One, the Type R badge in front to let people know what you're driving, and also the red Honda badge. Most Hondas have a black and silver badge. This one is red, which was a hallmark of older Type R models back in the 1990s, and the latest Type Rs have brought it back as well, the red Honda badge to symbolize high performance. And next up, we move around to the back of the new Civic Type R, where you have a huge wing still. Just like the outgoing model, you have a huge wing on the new Civic Type R in back. It is a very characteristic and distinctive feature of this car, but I think it looks better than the one in the old car. The wing was a little excessive and kind of strangely shaped. This one, a more traditional performance car wing, although it is still huge. But aside from the wing, you have a generally cleaner design back here. Probably the biggest complaint that most people had about the design of the old Civic Type R was the rear end. It just looked totally overstyled and way too much, too excessive, too many cuts and lines and all that other stuff. This car, the new Civic Type R, has been cleaned up. It seems more rational, more reasonable, and aside from the big wing, it's almost a little subtle. Now, with that said, you do still have the 3 central exhaust pipes in the Civic Type R, which the old one had as well, and which has made this car kind of the butt of jokes. 3 exhaust pipes for 4 cylinders. It seems excessive and kind of overly showy. They're probably not really all that necessary, but that's what you have, and they've carried that on to the new Civic Type R as well. You also have a giant rear diffuser down here, as you can see. Looks big, looks aggressive, looks performance car. And also worth pointing out, back here you once again have a Type R badge over on the side and a red Honda badge in the middle, again to emphasize performance, but in a subtle way. You kind of have to know you're looking for that red badge there. And next up, here's an interesting exterior trait of the new Civic Type R. The wheels are actually smaller than the ones in the outgoing model. The old Civic Type R had 20-inch wheels. This car has 19-inch wheels. This has to be the only car going down in wheel size. Everything else is like, we got 27s now, it's great. But this car actually went down an inch in wheel size, which is interesting and very different from the trends in the rest of the industry. Now, with that said, one important thing to point out, even though the wheels are smaller, they are wider, and that means wider tires as well. It was 245 width tires on the old car, now it's 265 width. It's about a ½ inch wider, and that means there's more contact patch with the ground. It'll be interesting to see how the Type R community responds to this. The posers, who just like the look, will prefer the bigger wheels, but people who actually want the performance and the drivability will prefer the wider tires and the extra contact patch, and so this car should theoretically have a bit of an advantage. Now, it's also worth pointing out the new Civic Type R has a wider track than the outgoing model, which should also benefit it in terms of performance and handling, and the new Civic Type R has bigger brakes. These are Brembo brakes, 13.8 inches in front, should provide pretty good stopping power for a vehicle this size and weight. Also worth pointing out, in the vicinity of the wheels, black painted wheels only on the new Civic Type R. You can't get anything else, and you have black lug nuts for the first time. The old one had black painted wheels, but silver lug nuts, which kind of clashed. Now you got black wheels, black lug nuts, so rejoice if you like an all black look on your wheel. But anyway, next we move inside the new Civic Type R, where you have some pros and some cons. One big pro is the seats, which are awesome. Bright red, tight, grippy sport seats, which are also tremendously comfortable. These are fantastic seats. Alcantara, and they're tight on you so you won't slide around, but they feel great. They're really cool seats. The red is neat, and they have holes in the backrest part so you can put a racing seatbelt through it if you want. And of course, Type R is also embossed into the Alcantara on the headrest. Very cool seats in this car. Not quite as cool, in my opinion, is the red carpeting. Red floor mats I can get behind, but red carpeting, not really sure. Looks a little 1980s General Motors in here, maybe a little too much red, but then again, red is really what they were going for. And you can see red touches pretty much everywhere in this interior. You have, once again, the red Honda logo at the center of the steering wheel, as you can see. Like I said, a subtle touch to let you know it's a performance car. You also have red stitching on the door panel, on the center console, more red stitching, and on the shift boot, there's some red accents all throughout this car. Now, another nice and exclusive Type R touch is this little plaque on the passenger side of the dashboard. You can see it says Type R, and then it gives a little number. That is the serial number of this exact vehicle. So each one of these will have an individually numbered plaque, which is kind of a cool way to make this car feel more special. Now, you can also see that this Type R badge is mounted on this giant honeycomb panel that goes across the entire passenger side of the dashboard, from the center all the way over to the door panel. This is on all the new Civic models, and it's intended to kind of hide the climate control vents and provide a nice looking piece on the dashboard. And in this car, it also matches up to the honeycomb grille in front of the intercooler. So you have that sort of tie-in from the inside to the outside of the car. Now, one other Type R exclusive benefit you have in here is the gear selector, which you can see is this metal piece. This is distinctive to the Type R model, and it looks and feels like old Type R shifters from the 90s. They all have these sort of straight up metal cylinders for gear selectors, gear levers, and you have that here as well, which again is very Type R. And of course you can see the gear pattern on top in red, as you might expect. Now, Honda says they've improved the transmission in the new Civic Type R. They've given it a lighter flywheel, and they've adjusted the rev matching system to make it easier to use and better. And so this car should shift a little bit better than the outgoing model. Now, also in this vicinity, you can see a selector that says drive mode, a little switch here that you can use to adjust the drive modes. You have 3 different drive modes: comfort, sport, and individual, the last of which is obviously configurable. But there is also a 4th drive mode that you access with a button directly above the drive mode switch. It is the Plus R drive mode. If you go into Plus R, it obviously optimizes your performance, and it changes your gauge cluster. You can see how much it changes here. Suddenly, you have the tachometer taking up most of your gauge cluster screen, and check it out, the top of the red line is the honeycomb pattern that you have in the grille and on the dashboard, which is kind of cool to see. Now, when you're in the Plus R mode, you'll notice there's also information displayed below that you might be interested in if you're on the racetrack, like oil pressure, engine temperature, stuff you may not need to know while you're driving around day to day, but it's more relevant if you're high performance driving, like you might be doing if you're in Plus R mode. Now, also in the gauge cluster here, worth pointing out, you have shift lights. You can see when the car is off, these little holes above the gauge cluster screen. Well, when the car is running and you get into the red line, these turn on as shift lights, so you know when to shift, kind of in your peripheral vision, if you couldn't figure that out anyway. Kind of a cool performance car touch in the gauge cluster. Now, speaking of various distinctive tech features in this car, unique to the Type R, the center infotainment system has a feature called Log R, and if you tap on that, it's an app that has various performance functions. At its home screen, it shows you all sorts of different meters, like oil pressure, oil temperature, all this different stuff that might be important to see on the racetrack, but you can also use the Log R app to get a score that rates your performance driving. These are some historical scores this car has given to previous people who have driven it, and it apparently rates you on your smoothness based on your braking, your accelerating, your turning, how smooth of a high performance driver you are. And it can show you various times and moments where it measured your smoothness for acceleration, turning, all this stuff, specific things you can see on a map. Oh, you weren't smooth enough through there, you were too fast, too slow, and it will show you that logged into this Log R app in the infotainment screen. Kind of interesting. The intent is to make you a smoother, high performance driver by rating your driving in real time. Now, aside from these performance touches in the screens that I've shown you, the gauge screen and the center screen, the screens in this car are fine, but not particularly amazing. The center infotainment screen, frankly, is a little bit behind the times. It's a smaller screen, and it doesn't have the functionality that's offered by some rivals. Like, you can't see 2 things on it at once. The resolution isn't great, especially for the backup camera, which is just really not good at all. It's not the best and most advanced screen. It does have wireless Apple CarPlay, however, which frankly is what most people want these days, so maybe it's not that big of a drawback that they didn't waste a lot of money on the screen. Now, the gauge cluster screen, same deal. It works, it's functional, but it's not that configurable. You can't make full screen changes to it unless you're in Plus R mode, like see a full screen map or music and your phone. You don't have that much configurability. Now, with that said, you can switch from traditional dials like the ones here to sort of dials over on the the sides of the screen, which does magnify the info panels that you can configure a little bit more, and that helps and makes it a little more configurable, but it's still not quite as good as some rivals and not as configurable or as full screen changeable as you might want. Still decent tech in this car, just not cutting edge at the forefront. Now, with that said, one nice benefit of the Civic Type R, you do have a wireless charging pad in here, which more and more cars are offering, and this one has as well. One drawback, no heated seats in this car. I guess that's just the price you pay to have cool Alcantara sport seats. You lose the heating element. Now, on the plus side, I do like the climate control switches. You have these little switches for the climate control vents, and they're very fun to move up, down, left, right, and they make changing and adjusting the position of the climate vents rather exciting and interesting. They are cooler than what you have in basically every other car. Back to the downside, though, the interior of this car, well, frankly, it's a Civic. That's always been the drawback of the WRXs and the Civic Type Rs, the Focus STs. All the hot hatches are based on kind of average compact cars. And so the material quality isn't amazing in here, not incredibly luxurious or high-end, but that's what you're getting. You're paying for a relatively affordable compact performance hatchback. And what you really want is the driving characteristics. And next up, we move on to the back seat of the new Civic Type R, which is, well, frankly, not as cool as the front. You lose the cool red Alcantara sport seats. In fact, the back seat of the Type R just looks like the back seat of the regular Civic. They made the front cool, but they didn't quite do the same treatment to the back. Now, with that said, it's pretty roomy back here. The latest Civic is a lot longer than previous Civic models, and there's decent space back here for adults, which is nice to see. Just won't be as cool as up front. Now, it is worth pointing out there are a few performance touches back here. For one thing, these cool sport seats in front. On the back, they say Type R, so rear passengers can stare at that and at least be reminded they're in a cool car, even if their own rear seat isn't quite as cool. You also have the red carpeting from the front brought into the back. Red carpeting back here doesn't really look great, like I said up front, and I think it looks actually even weirder in back because there's more of it, but that's what you got, red carpeting. You also have red seat belts back here, just like you did up front, and some red stitching, again, on the door panel, and some more red stitching in the seats to add a little more performance. Now, a couple drawbacks back here. You have cup holders in the center, which is nice to see, but that comes at the expense of a middle seat. This car is only a 4-seater, 2 up front, 2 in back. There's no middle seat in the back, so you can't carry 5 people, kind of limits the practicality a little bit. Another drawback, there's no climate vents back here, no climate controls, which is expected at a car like this, but there's no charge ports back here, which is disappointing. Even on a performance car with performance seats, you'd expect to have a USB port or 2 for rear passengers, but you don't. Again, limits practicality in the back seats a little bit. And finally, we move on to the rear of the Civic Type R, the cargo area. Like I said, all of these Civic Type R models are hatchbacks. You open up the back and you can see it's a pretty good sized cargo area back here. It really does have the practicality that people want from a hot hatchback. And of course, the rear seats fold down. You can see, fold them down and you get far more space back here in case you want to carry around a TV in your high-performance Civic Type R. Now, one very interesting quirk of the Civic Type R, the hatchback, is the cargo cover. You can see it's in place here, covering the cargo area, fairly standard, but the weird part is it goes from side to side. It starts on the driver's side and clips in over on the passenger side, spanning across the cargo area of the car. What an interesting, quirky little cargo cover. All right, driving the new Civic Type R. Now, 5 years ago, I reviewed the outgoing Civic Type R, and I wasn't incredibly complimentary. And a lot of other people were complimentary, but I thought there were some real flaws with the car, the styling being the most obvious. But I also thought the car was not built all that well, and that frankly, the driving experience could have been improved. So now here we are with a new Civic Type R, and I think they've addressed a lot of that. And I think this car is a big step up over the outgoing one. So first, let's talk about driving experience and specifically the powertrain and acceleration. And I'm going to start with torque steer. So when in a front wheel drive car, when you floor it from a stop, traditionally the driven wheels are getting so much power sent to them that they kind of hop in one direction, send the car off. And I recently reviewed the Mazda Speed 3 and it had that problem. It had considerable torque steer, and that was an issue of front wheel drive, powerful front wheel drive cars over the last decades. Honda has bragged with this car that they've eliminated torque steer. They've gotten it figured out. And the truth is, they have. If you floor this car from zero, floor the accelerator, It doesn't torque steer, but what it does do is wheel hop. You get a lot of wheel hop, like the car is fighting against wanting that much power to go through the front wheels. And frankly, I find wheel hop to be almost as jarring as torque steer. The thing that Honda has done impressively well here is because the torque steer is eliminated, it's not the acceleration from 0 that's impressive, it's from 20 to 60 or 30 to 70 or whatever, mid-range acceleration. In other front-wheel drive cars doing mid-range fast acceleration, you get sent all over the road and it's a disaster. In this car, there's none of that. From a stop, you get that wheel hop and it still feels like you're doing too much. It's not steering, but instead it's like bouncing, and that sucks. But the mid-range is where this car shines. Now, speaking of the acceleration, let's talk about this powertrain. This is a great engine. It was a great engine in the old Civic Type R, and I think it's just as good and in fact a little bit better in this one. High-performance Honda models in the past have been criticized for having a lot of power and not much torque, and they really didn't feel like they had any sort of power until you got high into the rev range. This car is not like that, and neither is the last Civic Type R. The S2000 was like that very famously. This car feels like it has good, potent power at all segments of the rev range. Now, let's talk about gearing. Interesting items there. This car has a rev match feature. Probably you can turn it off. Usually I turn off rev matching in cars I drive. In this car, it's so good, there's no reason to turn it off. If you attempt to downshift in this car, in any gear, it perfectly rev matches. It's butter smooth to go into gears. Honda's shifters have always been fantastic, shifters and clutches. It's just probably one of the most enjoyable manuals outside of a Porsche, or maybe a gated Ferrari from back in the day. Two other important things I want to cover. One is the ride quality. It's pretty rough. This car sort of almost reminds us of the old Ford Focus RS in terms of its roughness. Now, I'm driving it in sport mode, but you drive in sport mode, right? I mean, like, that's what you do. And the ride is pretty harsh. You feel bumps, you feel pavement things. This is with going down an inch in wheel size. The ride is just pretty damn harsh. That's just sort of the reality of the situation with this car. But let's talk about that handling for a second. Steering and handling with this car is excellent. I really love the linear steering feel. I really love how much control you feel like you have over the car. The one drawback that I find interesting about these Civic Type R models, this one and the last one, the old Civic Type Rs in the 90s, I'd never driven one, but I drove an Integra Type R, which seems pretty similar. Part of the fun of that car was it was just very peppy and lightweight, and you just felt like you were in total control at all times. This car feels like that still relative to other modern cars, which have gotten big, but it definitely doesn't have that sort of like peppy little feeling you had in old Acuras, in old Integra Type Rs. The old Civic Type Rs were just so little and so small, and that's something that it's difficult to get back. And I understand that's difficult to get back, we're not gonna get it back, but I'm just lamenting it for people who are thinking this is gonna feel like that. Overall, I think that the situation with this new Civic Type R is this. This is a great car. It looks way better than the old one. The interior is nicer. The old one had kind of a crappy Civic interior. This one still has a Civic interior, but the new Civic's interior is just not all that crappy. It's not great. It's not a luxury car, but it's fine. So in my view, you got a great $44,000 car. Unfortunately, it seems like dealer markups are probably going to be putting this in the $50,000 to $60,000 to $65,000 range. And at that point, it's a darn tough sell. It just really is. There's so many cars you can get, including used cars, in that price point that, as cool as this is, it makes sense in the 40 to 50 range, and it really starts to unravel above that. And so I know there's going to be people who pay up for that. This is a front-wheel drive 4-cylinder car. Paying $60,000, $70,000 just doesn't seem prudent to me. And so that's the new 2023 Honda Civic Type R. This car is an improvement over the old one in basically every way. On the outside, on the inside, the technology, the driving experience, it's all better, and it can be yours for $44,000 plus some additional dealer markup that costs as much as a bathroom remodel. Anyway, now it's time to give the new Civic Type R a Doug score. And the Doug score is here, 62 out of 100, which puts the new Civic Type R in direct competition with the Ford Focus RS and the outgoing Volkswagen Golf R, which I think are gold standard modern hot hatchbacks. Frankly, the Civic Type R does a great job bridging the gap between these two. The Type R offers a more daily usable experience than the rough-riding Focus RS. The Type R has a nicer interior, better tech, better ride quality, and the Type R is also more engaging and exciting than the Golf R. I think the new Type R is an excellent hatchback, especially now that it's not ugly anymore.